ISIS, Whoopi Goldberg, and Brian Flores. I'm Cecily Fernandez, and this is the Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Cecily Fernandez. Joining us today are conservative columnist for the Washington Examiner, Quin Hillyer. Quin, nice to see you.
Thanks, Cecily. Glad to be on with you.
Libertarian and Florida attorney Addison Hosner. Addison, great to have you.
Thank you, Cecily. Great to be here.
And progressive political reporter James Rosen. James, great to see you.
Great to see you, Cecily, and everyone else.
And welcome to everyone. This week, U.S. Special Forces killed a leader of the Islamic State. Here's the story from ABC News.
A significant counterterrorism mission in northwest Syria. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris observing from the Situation Room. The target, ISIS leader Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurayshi.
Thanks to the bravery of our troops, this horrible terrorist leader is no more.
The president ordered the mission near the Turkey-Syria border, an area known to be home to Islamic extremist groups including Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The White House confirming al-Qurayshi exploded a bomb at the beginning of the raid that killed himself and members of his own family. Officials say President Biden directed the Department of Defense to take every precaution to limit civilian deaths. They add that the mission was complicated because al-Qurayshi was running a global terror unit out of the location, with his family living on the upper floor.
Knowing that this terrorist had chosen to surround himself with families, including children, we made a choice to pursue a special forces raid at a much greater risk than to our own people, rather than targeting him with an airstrike.
There were no U.S. casualties, and officials say the mission ran like clockwork.
James, how significant do you think this operation, which took out the head of ISIS, is for the U.S.?
Well, I think it's significant. It was just a little over 20 years ago that the Islamic State, of course, attacked the Twin Towers in New York and other places and killed more than 3,000 people. It wasn't called the Islamic State then, but it was still the same group of people. It was a little more than 10 years ago that we killed Osama bin Laden. What's different this time is that the leader of the Islamic State, who reportedly has been killed or blew himself up in a suicide during a special forces raid, was not only not a household name, I can't even begin to pronounce his name, whereas Osama bin Laden, because of the 9/11 attacks, was a household name. He may have been this was before the rise of Donald Trump, he may have been the most famous person in the world. And so when we killed Osama bin Laden, I say we, when the United States Special Forces, Delta Forces killed Osama bin Laden a little more than 10 years ago, I remember television programming in the United States and around the world broke into their regular programming. The wire services issued bulletins. This was a big story today, but it wasn't that level. It wasn't that level of a story. And I think the fear it raises is that we're becoming complacent. That the more time passes after the 9/11 attacks, and of course we've had a global pandemic that's killed many more people than the 9/11 attacks. We've had a president who, to say the least, drew all the attention to himself. A lot has happened, but I fear that the more that time passes since the 9/11 attacks, the more complacent we'll become. And it was complacency that to some degree produced the 9/11 attacks. So this is a big story. It's getting some attention. I think maybe should be getting more attention, but let's remember there will be another leader of the Islamic State, and if we kill that leader, there will be another leader, and this is one of the difficulties of overcoming radical fundamentalist jihadism.
Quin, what do you think about? Do you think this killing of the top ISIS leader deserves more attention than it's getting?
I do. And frankly, I say that even though in my day of work today, only got a chance to pay just a little attention to it, and I'm in the news business. So I plead guilty myself, but it is a big deal. It is these organizations, even though they are very much dispersed in some ways, they really do have a head. And it is true that if you cut off the head, you greatly diminish the ability of the body to operate. And it takes them a while to regroup. They don't have, they don't have sort of a automatic succession in a way that allows them, they don't have the resources to immediately get back up and running. So this is a big deal. It's a good thing. It's a feather in the cap of the president and the armed forces. And this is one time I think that no matter what your ideology is, as an American, you can say this is a good thing. And kudos to the president.
Addison, do you think that this operation is a meaningful success for the Biden administration?
Yeah, that's something I'm going to touch on is after the whole Afghanistan evacuation debacle and all the images that Americans saw, the frustration was palpable. We were, rather upset with how things are being handled in the Middle East. As James pointed out, this story is kind of under the radar right now. And he also pointed out that there's a rotating door of leaders. Some reports say the average lifespan of these leaders has been about 3 years. So we're sure the Hydra head will come back. The cycle will repeat itself. But I do think this is a major victory for the United States, especially for an administration whose foreign policy has been under a lot of scrutiny. Overall, it's a great success. It's a great thing to hear, and we'll see what comes of it.
James, what do you think about that point that this is, something that's needed and good for the Biden administration, who's been facing some pretty challenging poll numbers?
Well, when Osama bin Laden was killed, I wrote an article about how even the fiercest critics of President Obama, who okayed the operation and watched it in real time, even his fiercest critics were praising him. The only praise I heard today for the operation and for President Biden came from Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. There may be other praise coming in, but I think because politics is so much more partisan now and more poisonous, there will be less praise for President Biden. But it is a very good day for him and for the United States.
Quinn, how much do you think part of this is because on the left, it just doesn't seem like this kind of operation is the priority? Do you think that's a part of why Biden hasn't received too much praise from his side about this
yes,
operation?
I think it's not as much a priority on the left, and then of course on the right, most people are loath to give any credit to Joe Biden. So that has tamped down the praise from both sides. Look, in some ways, this was an easy call. Apparently, they've known where the guy was for a while. They could have gone in with precision bombing and gotten him. So it's not as if it took great bravery by Biden to do it. But on the other hand, he is the president. He did order it. I'm sure he had to review lots and lots of options, and whatever the case was, it worked. And when it worked, you do give the president some credit.
Addison, what do you think about that? What you mentioned before about this, kind of being under the radar, but it does seem like it's kind of under the radar for Biden's own party.
Yeah, as far as being under the radar for our politics and from the Americans' perspective, it's clearly happening. But I think on the other side of this, the other side of the equation on ISIS and the radical terrorists over in the Middle East, I think this continues to send the message, though, and they've heard it loud and clear, that the United States will find you and they will take you out. We've done this now multiple times, and I think we're going to continue to do it. We'll see if this comes back to the forefront when the elections start rolling around, and primarily for the presidency. See if this comes up as a champion of our foreign policy working. But as far as it working for the left in any type of midterms or anything like that, I'm not sure it's going to have that effect.
Okay. Well, also this week, talk show host Whoopi Goldberg was suspended from The View over her remarks regarding the Holocaust. Here's Inside Edition with the story.
Whoopi Goldberg apologizing on The View today for saying the Holocaust was not about race.
I regret my comments, as I said, and I stand corrected. I also stand with the Jewish people, as they know and y'all know.
Whoopi caused an uproar Monday discussing a Tennessee school district's controversial ban on Maus, the Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel about the Holocaust.
The Holocaust isn't about race.
Her co-host seemed taken aback.
No, it's not about race.
Ethnicity.
No, it's about
a different race.
But it's not about race. It's not about race.
What is it about?
Because it's about man's inhumanity to man.
Quinn, how do you think Whoopi should be, do you think Whoopi should be fired for her comments about the Holocaust?
No, I don't. I think she said something ignorant and stupid, but without any malicious intent. And the simple fact is, and this is a fact, Jews are not a race, they are a people. So technically she was correct. Now, in that context, when she's talking about Nazis disagree. Nazis treated Jews as a race. And to make any kind of comparison along those lines when you're talking about Nazis is on its face offensive. But her point was not anti-Semitic, and I am no Whoopi Goldberg fan, but at some point you've got to say, okay, somebody said something stupid. They eventually apologized. Even at the beginning, it was clear she was making a different point than anything with any malicious intent, no anti-Semitism involved. So you let her cool her jets for a week or two, and then you bring her back and you say, don't do it again.
Addison, it seems like, as far as malicious intent, some people have been canceled for a lot less, I think, than these comments by Whoopi Goldberg. Do you think that she deserves to be canceled, or do you think she should keep her job?
This is something that I've looked into a lot. And I think the United States, our population has an issue with objectivity and controlling our own emotions. Subjectively, when, I heard the clip, like many people, I had a knee-jerk reaction, emotionally was a little upset that she'd make the comparison. But the more I began to look into what she was saying, especially after hearing her apologies and things, you begin to put more context to it. And our problem is we jump to conclusions and then look at any facts afterwards, where we need to examine the facts of the situation and then come to our conclusion. I don't think there's any ill will that was actually put forth by Whoopi, and the fact that Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League has come out and accepted her apology, I think that speaks volumes to what I think the populace should do as well. People need to live and learn, and if you make mistakes or have a slip of the tongue and you're punished and canceled for it, I think that's going to be more harming to our ideas of freedom of speech and what you're allowed to say and get away with. If it was more malicious than what was actually said, maybe I'd be speaking a different tune. But as far as I'm concerned, this was a Freudian slip and an emotionally charged moment for her that she has looked back on and reflected.
James, what do you make of the Whoopi Gate?
Oh, and I'm Jewish. I think it's overblown. I do think that obviously, this is to state the obvious. Whenever you're talking about the Holocaust, you have to be extremely careful, just as Whoopi would remind us and many others would remind us. Whenever you're talking about the Civil War and slavery, you have to be careful. The Holocaust, Marjorie Taylor Greene, if I'm not mistaken, just in recent weeks or months, has said a couple things about the Holocaust that were much, much, much more offensive than what Whoopi said. And, not to get too partisan here, but fellow Republicans didn't breathe a breath or bat an eyelash. And she didn't apologize. Well, in her own way, she tried to apologize, but she made it worse. And Whoopi clearly apologized. We should accept her apology. The interesting thing about Jews and race is that if you take the Old Testament literally and believe that all Jews are directly descended from Abraham, we are a race. And the only country that believes that Judaism is a race, since Hitler, is Israel. The Israelis do believe that Judaism is a race, not just a religion. So it's a complex topic, as has been said. She apologized. Let's move on.
We will move on. Finally, former Miami Dolphins head coach Brian Flores filed suit against the National Football League alleging racist hiring practices. Here's NBC News' coverage.
Is the NFL racist? I think the numbers speak for themselves. There's one black head coach.
Until just weeks ago, Brian Flores was the second, but the Miami Dolphins fired him after back-to-back winning seasons. Flores and his attorneys have now filed a class action lawsuit against the NFL and several teams, alleging discrimination against black coaches.
There needs to be a change.
Flores says the New York Giants only interviewed him as a sham to comply with the Rooney Rule, an NFL requirement that minority candidates be considered for head coaching jobs. The suit says the team had already decided to hire Brian Daboll, a coordinator for the Buffalo Bills who had no head coaching experience. It includes screenshots of texts allegedly sent to Flores by Patriots head coach Bill Belichick mistakenly, days before Flores even interviewed, congratulating him on getting the Giants job. Flores then asked, "Coach, are you talking to Brian Flores or Brian Daboll? Just making sure." Belichick replied with an expletive. "Sorry, I blanked this up."
When you realized that he meant to send that text message to someone else, what went through your head? I was humiliated.
The Giants are defending their hiring practices, writing in part, "Brian Flores was in the conversation to be our head coach until the 11th hour. Ultimately, we hired the individual we felt was most qualified." Flores also alleges Miami Dolphins owner Stephen Ross offered to pay him $100,000 per loss in 2019 to improve the team's draft position.
It's disrespect to the game.
So, Addison, let me start with you. Do you feel Mr. Flores has a case against the NFL?
He has a case. His complaint has been filed, and our standard for what qualifies as a complaint is pretty easy to pass. The question here is, though, what is the standing and if he has enough evidence to be able to prove it, which I think when we move into the next section of this case, which will be the discovery process in which Mr. Flores' party will be requesting documents from the NFL and the three named organizations being the Giants of New York, the Miami Dolphins, and the Denver Broncos, to see what these communications actually entail. You better believe they're going to fight tooth and nail to not release these communications, claim privilege on all sorts of levels. I'm sure they have fantastic legal teams, but I think it goes without saying that there is some issues here, primarily with the Rooney Rule, which was put in place back in 2003, that mandates that NFL programs need to interview an ethnic minority coach before making a hiring. But there's no requirement that they need to hire an ethnic minority coach after interviewing them. So that's where I think the case is going to really turn. And I think there's some other facts within the case that are going to be more consequential to the NFL than maybe even the discrimination.
James, how much of a problem do you think this case is for the NFL?
Well, the NFL will hire the best lawyers and defend itself. But if you compare the NBA and the NFL, both are majority black sports. The majority of the athletes who play in those two leagues are black. I think a higher percentage in the NBA, but still a very high percentage in the NFL. And the ways in which those two leagues have handled race over the last decade is just hugely different. Colin Kaepernick, who had a pretty spectacular year as a quarterback, still cannot even get a tryout, cannot even find a place as a second or third string quarterback for refusing to kneel during the national anthem. That does sound like a plantation. That does sound like a blacklist. He's clearly better than 20 quarterbacks in the league. That sort of thing doesn't happen in the NBA. The NBA has really changed. It's directly gearing its marketing toward young people and especially young black people. I think this is a problem. I think there's only one, if I'm not mistaken, there's only one black coach among 32 teams in the NFL. There's, a half dozen or 8 or 10 black coaches in the NBA. They've changed a lot more quickly in response to the demographics of the league than the NFL has.
Quinn, what about you? Do you think this is a big problem for the NFL?
It's a big problem for the NFL, but more ethically and morally and internally than legally. I think the legal case is largely bogus because on the racial front, what he is accusing the NFL of doing is not abiding by its own internal rules, which are not laws, and they are under no obligation to even having to have adopted, much less apply the Rooney Rule in the first place. It looks like he might have the goods that they broke the Rooney Rule. And if he does, then that's a bad thing by the NFL. His other point, or his other allegation, that the owner of the Miami Dolphins tried to pay him off to throw some games in order to get a better draft choice. That, in terms of the integrity of the game, is actually more explosive. And it is an internal matter for the league, but if it is true, the league needs to come down really, really hard on the Miami Dolphins owner. I'm not saying that throwing the games is more important than being fair to black people, but I'm saying in terms of the internal dynamics of the rules, the integrity of the game is absolutely destroyed if teams are throwing games. So that's going to be one to watch from a PR standpoint. This whole thing is more PR than it is legally strong, again, because he, as far as I can see as of yet, has not identified a particular law that the NFL broke. Now, he might pull out something, but right now he's saying the NFL broke an internal rule. And it's a good rule. It's a rule they should have. And it's a rule that they should live up to, but that does not a legal case make.
Addison, how do you feel about this, what Quin mentioned, this accusation of being offered money to for every game Mr. Flores lost? You think that's potentially even a bigger threat to the NFL?
It very well could be, simply on the basis of it was $100,000 per loss that the Dolphins would pay Mr. Flores at the conclusion of the season to get a better draft pick. If that's the case, and that can be proven, which of course I'm not sure if that will occur in this case, since the discovery needs to be relevant to the proceedings, and in the causes of actions brought by Mr. Flores, in that cause was nothing involving the pay scheme. That was simply a fact that was put in the precedent in the statement of facts. So whether or not that comes up in this case is one thing, but I do believe if it's found that the NFL managers are offering money to coaches to throw games, now I think you have investigations where it potentially opens up into a whole bag of potential gambling, fixing of games, knowledge that a game will be lost at a certain date, backroom deals. We don't know how deep that really goes. And if that gets out, the integrity of the sport, I think, will be forever altered, and it'd be difficult to come back from.
Okay. Well, I'm sure a lot of interested football fans will be watching that case closely. We are going to move on to most underreported story of the week. James, I'd like to start with you. Do you have your most underreported story of the week?
Well, here's a story that's been reported, but I personally think it's so outrageous it should get more attention. The Republican National Committee, or the RNC as it's known, is bringing a motion that has been signed and supported by at least 50. The RNC is the governing body of the Republican Party. It's got a couple hundred members, I believe, something in that range. There are members who are pushing the idea that Adam Kinzinger, Representative Kinzinger, I believe of Wisconsin, and Representative Cheney of Wyoming should be kicked out of the party, or at least kicked out of the House party, the House Republican Conference, which means they would, unless they wanted to become Democrats, they're both conservative, that's not going to happen. They would be two congressmen without a party. And this is just a huge deal that just because they think that the January 6th violent insurrection that killed, police officers and hurt a lot of people, a historic insurrection, just because Congresswoman Cheney and Congressman Kinzinger think that should be investigated by Congress, that their party is now interested in possibly kicking them out of the House conference. I just think it's outrageous, and it shows where the Republican Party, or large elements of it, stands today.
Okay. Quin, what about you? What's your most underreported story of the week?
I wish I had time to say more about what James just said, but I completely agree with him. It is despicable what these members of the RNC are doing to Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, and I would love to go off on that. That said, the most underreported story of the week just happened yesterday. A lawsuit filed against the new law in New York City that allows illegal aliens or no, not necessarily illegal, just allows non-citizens to vote in New York City elections. And the clever thing and the explosive thing about this new lawsuit is that it does it on the basis of race, because it notes that there was a racial or ethnic intent behind the law and an effect. And it is being brought by 4 Black voters who range across the political spectrum, by the way, who are saying that the deliberate intent is to increase Hispanic and Asian voting. And in doing so, that necessarily dilutes the percentage of Black vote. And they say that is a violation of the 15th Amendment. And they provide a lot of case law that supports that. This could be a very, very explosive case. And it really puts Democrats in a bad way if they have to defend this incredibly unpopular law. In the rest of the country, almost nobody wants non-citizens to vote in U.S. elections.
Addison, what about you? Do you have a most underreported story of the week for us?
Yeah, and nowhere near as great as those two. Those are meaty. However, I do find this rather fascinating. I haven't heard much about it. Effective yesterday, the United States Army is discharging soldiers for not getting the vaccine, and it's going to be through general discharges, which means they get to keep the majority of their benefits except they lose the GI Bill. I'm more interested to know in what is going to occur after this, as general discharges are able to be appealed. So the application of what scrutiny the courts will apply, whether it's strict scrutiny, which is our court's highest level, or just a rational basis test on whether they think the ends justify the means. It'll be interesting to see what comes of it. But anytime the military is removing members, not dishonorably, but just discharging them, I think it should give us a moment to take a look at what's happening.
Yes. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition. Thanks to our guests, and thank you for watching or listening to The Square Circle. I'm Cecily Fernandez. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video, or give it a 5-star rating on your podcast platform. We'll see you next week.